Hi, welcome back to this week's episode of Building Talk. I'm Bryan Falk, and I've got Ben Rufenacht. Am I pronouncing your last name right, Ben?
Rufenacht.
Rufenacht. Okay, I'm not sure if I've ever said that out loud. I've known Ben for about a year, and Ben is specializes in flood controls and levees. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you do and your title?
So I am a water resource engineer, and I mainly deal with surface water modeling. So in the way of using it for floodplain mapping, to assess dams and levees, and to design city stormwater systems and flood control systems.
So you're doing everything involving flooding in cities, basically. I mean, that's kind of what you specialize in. Do you do rural areas as well?
Do rural areas as well. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Tell me a little bit. I've always been intrigued because the city of Topeka, where we live, is actually looking at changing its riverfront a little bit and possibly changing the levees. And tell me a little bit more about the different ways in which you control flooding in a city.
So this kind of comes as there's been phases throughout time that people have done for flood control. So start of the 20th century, there wasn't really much flood control at all, and people are building up these cities, and then a big flood happens early 20th century through a lot of the Mississippi River Basin and destroys a lot of stuff. And that's when they first started building. That's when the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation kind of formed and started building the first flood control dams, so large dam structures that will hold the water back from a lot of that flooding. And then that happens a little bit slowly there at first. People are getting started on that kind of stuff. They also do it for water supply in certain areas, so there's multi-purposes for building these dams. And then come post-World War II, this is when the big push for all America's infrastructure happened. So this is when most of the flooding infrastructure that you see throughout the country was built during this push that started basically in the 50s and kind of went pretty strong until about the 70s maybe, and then it has slowed way down since then. And that's when we built all these, and a lot of this was pushed. There was another very large flood event that happened in the early 50s, which here in Topeka there's some famous photos of how much of Topeka was underwater.
Yeah,
and
the
then
51 flood.
Yeah, it was the same story through a lot of the Mississippi River Basin. It was a pretty devastating flood all around. Not quite as bad as that one that happened in the early 1900s, so that one was even worse.
So there's typically a infrastructure reaction to large catastrophic events.
And that flood happened to come at the same time we were doing this Eisenhower's big infrastructure push. So the government was funneling a bunch of money into these programs. We were building the interstate highway system. So we also just started funneling a bunch of money to build all these levee systems and a bunch of dams. Thousands and thousands of dams went up in this small amount of time.
So a dam can control flooding by kind of pooling the water that would normally flood in a controlled area and allowing some to spill out. Is that right?
So it's holding a majority of the water back, and then a small amount is allowing a small amount to flow slowly. So it's kind of a controlled small amount. Slowly.
Here in Kansas, we don't have too many dams. Is that correct?
That is not correct.
That's not correct. Okay,
we have a very high number of dams in Kansas.
Maybe I'm just not thinking really large dams.
You don't know. You just most of them go invisible to most people. It's a lot of rural watershed type dams, which are flood control dams, but they're mostly protecting agricultural land and that kind of stuff. So they're kind of just out there where most people don't see them. Then there's several large core dams too, of course. And we have Clinton Reservoir, we have Perry Reservoir, we have Tuttle Creek Reservoir. So just right around us.
So, like for instance, Lake Shawnee, it's a local lake around here. It has a kind of a dam. Would you describe that as
definitely a dam?
Yeah, and there's a spillway as part of that.
Yep.
And is that a flood control measure, or is that just to create
a flood control dam?
It's kind of a recreational lake.
Yes, and so they have multi-purpose. So most of them are used as recreation, but almost all of them have a secondary purpose of either. I mean, most of them weren't just built for recreation. Most of them were built for flood control or water supply.
Okay. And so when I think dams, I often think Hoover Dam, big concrete structures, but often they're just piles of dirt with rock on them.
Around here, they're mostly just earthen dams. They're all dirt.
Great. And is there a kind of a technical description that describes a concrete dam like the Hoover Dam versus an earthen embankment? Not really. They're
just
dams
a concrete
or dams.
dam and a Earthen dam.
Good. Okay, great. Well, tell me, okay, so that you can do a levee or you can do a dam. Now, tell me about the different types of levees. I know that some levees have gates in them that open up and allow access to the river. Can you talk about the different types of levees and how the best way to allow access to the river from a city, if the city is right up on the river? How do you connect to the city to the river? That's a big part of urban design in my mind.
So levees are just essentially, just like dams, they're just piles of dirt, but they run along the sides of your water course instead of blocking your water course, instead of running right in the line of your water course. So they're protecting flooding from going out from the main channel of the river and allowing flow in the river to continue through, just preventing it from getting into the populated areas and flooding, causing damage there. So the reason you see a lot of gates and levees is because you have other rivers. So you have the Kansas River here, then we have Shunga Creek coming in. So where you see, which I guess there isn't a gate on Shunga Creek, bad example, but where the smaller rivers come in, you have to let the water into the Kansas River. So they need to let water pass through, or else you're going to just pull up behind the levee and it's going to act like a dam if you don't let it through. But then the same thing can happen when the flooding's on the Kansas River. You have to be able to close those gates so that the flooding doesn't back up through the pipe backwards and flood your city.
So you're talking about an actual gate between a smaller creek or river and the larger river. So I don't know if I've actually paid attention enough to actually seen those. I was actually talking more about pedestrian connection between the river and the city. I've seen some examples where it's near a downtown and there's a large gate that opens up.
That'll be just a floodgate.
Is that pretty much the same technology?
It works the exact same way. So basically when the river starts flooding up the river, they actually need to close the city of Ottawa has one, a very large one right across the highway. And so they're just designed so when water starts rising, they have a plan in place where they shut those gates down, which it's a big exercise to shut down that gate.
Are those risky?
It takes a lot of work.
They
are risky because you have to have people on the ready when a flood comes, but you usually have time, and that's when you just make sure. We've been part of that. We actually had to go down and watch them operate that gate so they could prove that it still worked.
Yeah. So they have to do tests
certified their levees. So they have to do a periodic test of it and make sure that the people that work there with the city know how to operate it and know that when this emergency comes, which it actually has been used. A lot of them haven't even been used, so people don't know, like, is this going to work when the flood comes? I don't know, but the Ottawa example, they have had to close that and use it.
Great. Okay, are there any new innovations occurring right now in flood control? Anything that maybe we haven't seen in our area, but maybe outside our area?
Well, so like I said, most of the flood control systems that you see, we think of today were built back they're 50, 60, 70 years old now. And they're nearing the end of their useful life. I mean, these things were designed with a 50-year shelf life, and now we're beyond 50 years on a lot of them. So, and we're not building, you don't see a lot of new levees being built. I mean, they kind of rebuilt the ones down in New Orleans after Katrina, but you really don't see a lot of new levees being built because that's kind of it's an old way of flood control. And so what we've realized is back in the day, they built all these levees and they're like, well, we're protecting our city. But they didn't think of what was happening everywhere else. The water's got to go somewhere. So a levee will generally just funnel water down and it'll move faster through your city because you're kind of narrowing down the channel it can go through. So it's more water moving faster. And so what you're doing is you're just causing more problems downstream. So the next city downstream has a bigger problem now. So the next city down, that compounds down to New Orleans is sitting there at the end.
So you're saying levees are not as popular because it's hard to control rivers because they're wild and then it's almost impossible to tame them, right?
And they're very expensive to maintain.
And so is there an alternative or are we just not controlling them?
So now we are kind of trying to design smarter systems that mimic nature more, really. And so you'll see a good example right over here on Jackson Street, here a block away from us, is the bioswale. So that's where you see all those natural grasses planted and natural flowers planted. That's a flood control structure there.
Stormwater retention ponds are now being required more in cities as well.
Yeah, so instead of just paving everything over and letting all the water, that makes water move a lot faster. None of it soaks down in the dirt. It all gets to the river, and that causes more flood issues. So now we're requiring any builders to do some sort of retention, some sort of mitigation as part of their
project. So rather
than
than trying to control the water at the river, we're trying to
controlled at the
absorb
source.
absorb the water into the soil in the city
Yeah.
rather than having a lot of hardscape.
It's essentially going back to the way it was before there was a city there.
Excellent. Great. Why do some cities have large levees and others do not? For instance, San Antonio has a river walk where everything is really close to the river. There's a lot of cities that really embrace their rivers, and others just really cut the river off from the rest of their city. Can you explain what's happening maybe at San Antonio as a case study if you've been there?
I have not been to San Antonio, but I'm not super familiar with their project, but I know a little bit about it. And what they do, what these cities do is they need some sort of flood control. So in the case of San Antonio, where the Riverwalk actually is, that's an old bend of the river. And what they were doing is they just diverted the river around the downtown area, and they were just going to pave over that part, and just that river's not there anymore. Mm-hmm. But then some designer came in, or first people came in and fought that. They're like, no, we want the river going through our area. We don't want to just pave it over. That's ugly, and we can take advantage of this.
So they took a trickle of the river, of a much larger river.
So they basically divert a small part away from the big diversion where the flood goes. Mm-hmm. And they also built a dam on the upstream end of it. So there's a big, and it's a dry dam, so you wouldn't even know it's a dam unless you looked at it or if it was wet. So it's kind of a wetlands upstream of it. And there's like soccer fields and stuff. You can put parks there, and then when it fills up with water, you just don't use it.
Wow.
And then a lot of the other part of the flooding is directed around to another river channel, and then where the actual Riverwalk is just an old channel, and they just have a small controlled amount trickling through. And if you want a closer example, City of Wichita has the same type of deal where they have the big ditch that runs around town, and that's where the flooding water goes. But then they have the nice they've reclaimed the river area as well, and they've built that little Discovery Center right there on the river, and they got the statue, the Keeper of the Plains, and that little park right there. And
are you familiar with, I think it's Baltimore that has the downtown baseball stadium, and I think it's in the middle or really close to the river, and they're really surrounded by river there as well. Are they doing the same thing, or are they?
I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay,
so
yeah, sorry. Okay, well, interesting. I love that strategy of creating kind of a dry dam and using that as soccer fields or having some other use. That's great.
That would be a modern use of how we're controlling flood now. Is we don't build buildings where the flooding can occur. We build parks.
So let's go back to Topeka. You're probably somewhat familiar with what they're proposing in Topeka for the Kansas River, right? Can you tell me a little bit about it as a case study, what you know about it, first of all? And one of the things that maybe hit me was that they're planning on putting whitewater rafting and a weir in there. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that and what your thoughts are as far as safety and as far as a river strategy? I know a lot of the people involved on it probably don't even have the expertise you do, so maybe they could listen to your ideas and learn something.
And I don't know a lot about what they're planning. I have heard that same thing, that they're looking at so I think somewhere in Iowa, they did a little whitewater rapids kind of little kayak stream along the side of their weir, and that's really a way it actually improves safety on the weir, because right now the weir it's just a straight drop, and there've been several deaths on our weir right here in Topeka on the Kansas River that have occurred right there just because people are out there boating, kayaking, and don't even realize it's there, and they're actually trying to go over it and end up drowning because it's the big drop that they just go straight. It's sheer drop, whereas this rapids would be like a little diversion. It kind of takes you around the side and is like an ease down into the lower part of the river instead of just a sudden drop. So it's actually a little recreational deal and a little safety improvement as well.
Interesting. Are they planning on doing a damming as part of the proposal in Topeka?
A dam?
Yeah.
Like just those low head dams, those little weirs, like what you're calling weirs.
So a weir is kind of a dam within the water that allows a little bit of water to spill.
Just what we call a low head dam. So
I gotcha.
A very short dam, and they're just controlling the water. The one here in Topeka is for our water supply.
Are weirs typically dangerous?
They don't have to.
To boaters, I should say.
I mean, they can be, but they aren't always. I mean, obviously, this whitewater rapids thing is a way to make it more safe for recreation, whereas now it's kind of just a sheer drop.
So we're always talking, we're taming the river again. Can rivers be tamed, do you think? Is it possible? Have we learned from our mistakes?
Not really.
They can't be tamed.
They can't completely be tamed. I mean, they're always going to beat us. I mean, look what's going on in Missouri right now. The Merrimack River is hitting record levels again, and I mean, they've tried. They've got levees there. Two of them have burst. Nature's going to win eventually.
I saw a presentation recently on the Steamboat Arabia. Are you familiar with that? It's an old steamship from 150 years ago or something like that that was found, I think, a mile or two away from the current path of the Missouri River, if I'm getting this correctly. Is it typical for a river to change paths as much as that?
Rivers change paths very regularly. I mean, it's the natural way for rivers is to meander, and then eventually those big bends break together, and then that meander is cut off, and those meanders can be a mile long, and then they just cut off this hook of the river, which is kind of what happened in San Antonio. The Riverwalk was actually one of those big hooks in the river that would eventually just dry up anyway.
Excellent. Okay, so I think we have a good understanding of rivers and river controls at this point. Let's go to more building the relationship between rivers, flooding, and buildings. Where would one go to access flood maps?
So you can go to FEMA's website, and they have a little map service center and a little search bar, and you can type in an address, and it'll take you to where the map you need is, and you can either download the map or you can go into their interactive map and just use it kind of like Google Maps.
Tell us, why are those maps important, and how did they come up with the data on those maps?
So those maps are showing the flood risk for any given area. So that is the area that's likely to flood. As a standard, they use the 1% annual chance flood. So in any given year, you have a 1% chance of that flood occurring. That's just the level they decided was a good level. It's also called the 100-year flood. And so it's showing you where the most likely places to flood are. And that's how they set insurance rates, is obviously how they use it.
And that was all based on surveyors' data from many, many years ago. Is that correct?
Well,
Yeah.
Depending on how old your maps are. I mean,
Yeah.
we're updating maps right now. That's what I do a lot with my work day, is we're updating them with new, so we don't need surveyors so much anymore. Now we have modern technology of LiDAR, which you stick the LiDAR sensors in a plane and they just have to fly over it, and then you have a really good topography of your area. And then we use that to we use rainfall statistics, we use river flow statistics to kind of determine what the 1% chance flow is, and then we model that flow through a river course, and we map what we find to
Interesting.
create these maps.
One of the comments I've heard as working on projects is there's a 100-year flood line, and that 100 years has flooded 4 times in the last 100 years. And the thought was a lot of times it's debris and other things that are kind of damming up areas of the way the water would flow. Is that typical? Do you see sometimes where that 100 years isn't really accurate?
Well, of course, it's all based on statistics. So all we have is historical records to go on.
Yeah.
And those historic records, I mean, maybe the last 50 years of historic record we have, when we've been keeping track, there hasn't been a true 100-year storm in that time, so we're under-predicting what the 100-year storm would be. So, I mean, it's all we have to go on. And then, of course, you have all these man-made changes. I mean, the 3 cities upstream of you built levees, so water comes a lot faster to your town. Flooding is more severe. Or we've paved over the entire countryside, so now no water is absorbed into the ground. It's all coming to the river faster than it was before, and more flood, higher flood. So there's many factors.
Tell us about, is there any restrictions on building in a floodplain typically, and what would those restrictions be?
So the restrictions are, so FEMA sets these mapping standards. You have kind of 2 things mapped generally on there. You have the floodway, which is basically a do not build area, and then you have the floodplain, which you can build in the fringes of that floodplain as long as you're, and this varies based on your local floodplain administrator, local rules, but generally it's at least a foot above the elevation shown in that 100-year floodplain. So you are allowed to fill in those, what they call the floodplain fringes, which these are kind of old regulations, and this is going to be changing a little bit through.
So typically you could build your
but
building up on a higher pad or on
Yeah.
stilts or something like that to
Yeah,
get out
yeah.
of the floodplain. Great. How does these flood maps affect people's insurance on their buildings and their ability to even get insurance?
Well, so it's just if you are in the floodplain, you are required to have flood insurance in order to get financing for your building. And that's how so you're not going to get a loan for your building if you don't have they're not going to give you a loan unless you show you have flood insurance if you're in in the designated floodplain. And of course, you can show that, well, actually, my building is elevated, so I'm not in it. So you can go and get a elevation certificate. You can have a surveyor come and show what the level of your building is compared to the level of the flooding, and then you can get yourself an exemption out of that.
Excellent. I think we had a conversation in the past about, I was talking to you about a building I was looking at possibly purchasing that was behind a levee, but it was fairly low in elevation. So I was asking if there's any risk related to this. And you'd mentioned that maybe the insurance rules might change so levees are no longer protecting these type of buildings from an insurance standpoint. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, it's been, policy discussions here, and they've been talking about it for years of changing this designation of this area behind a levee that's actually protected by a levee and creating the zone that's a protected by levee zone that you maybe pay right now you don't have to pay anything if you're there. But they're talking about changing the policy, so you have to change a reduced amount because you are protected, so you have a lower risk, but there still is risk because obviously these levees can break. So just to show a lower level of insurance to show that you have a lower level of risk, but still a risk.
So how would one know if they are in that lower level of risk, protected by a levee, but still there's a chance that it could flood if that levee broke?
Modern maps do show this, that they have started mapping this zone. So if your area has been updated somewhat recently, last few years, last 5 years or so, then they will show that zone, and you will be able to see that on the map when you search it. It's a different zone. I think it says like protected by levee. It's a zone protected by levee, so you'll be able to see it. It'll have a different symbol on the map that you look at. And if it's an old map that maybe won't be mapped, and then if you're in like a rural area, you may just have an old paper map that was made in the 70s, in which case, they aren't as accurate as our modern maps, obviously, and they didn't have these zones mapped out like that. So you just won't really know unless you're familiar with the area.
So can a building owner truly, do you think they can rely on levees? Should they rely on levees, or?
They can. I mean, levees, especially with the new program, since Katrina, FEMA's gotten on top of actually requiring all levees to be certified if they're going to be mapped as showing protection. So even to get this reduced zone of protected by levee, you have to go through a certification project, which is one of the things that we do. So we go and we inspect the levees, we do our modeling on them to make sure they can protect you from the 1% chance flood. We go through a full process, making sure they can operate their gates. That's where that comes in, making sure they have an updated operations manual and they know how to operate it. And so you're much more confident in the levees then when they have this periodic inspection and these updates.
So you might see a future though where maybe levees go away?
Well, they're becoming, like a lot of cities are they're saying, well, we can't afford to go through the certification process. We can't prove our levees no longer provide the 1% chance flood. In order to make them provide the 1% chance protection, we'll have to do a multi-million-dollar project just to get them up to speed. And we're a small town. We don't have that kind of money. So we're just going to leave them as they are, and people are going to be mapped in the floodplain. I mean, people are having to make these decisions whether they think it's worth it to pay the millions of dollars to upgrade their levees and maintain their levees, or to just let them go and deal with flood insurance.
We haven't really talked much about the Corps of Engineers and their role in the levees versus private contractors. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Educate me.
So,
seems like dams and levees are almost always associated with Corps of Engineers.
Well, certain ones are. So the Corps of Engineers controls. They designed and built many of the dams and levees. So all the bigger dams in Kansas were mostly designed by the Corps of Engineers and are operated by the Corps of Engineers. And then like the Topeka levee was built by the Corps of Engineers, and they're currently in the process of upgrading and making it certifiable now. And we're the private contractor that's certifying it. So we have two separate processes going on here, where the Corps of Engineers is building upgrades so that they can provide the protection that it's supposed to. And we're basically doing the inspection and saying, yes, this does provide, signing off on saying it does provide the protection.
Excellent. Well, one last question for you. My interest in this is connecting with rivers as a community. And do you have any ideas for ways that we can do a better job connecting and using rivers as a resource for different communities?
Well, obviously, as shown by San Antonio, as shown by Wichita, they can be a great resource. I mean, it's excellent what they've done to how they've taken advantage of these river systems and built these just great parks, great active areas, active kind of downtown areas that. And so, I mean, it's a process to get that done. So, I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into that. They spent the San Antonio example. They started that project in like the 30s, and it didn't become a popular riverwalk until the 60s or 70s or
that's probably
somewhere in
right.
there.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So it was many years. It was just this empty project kind of deal.
I remember visiting in the early 80s with my family. So, yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, Ben. I appreciate your knowledge and insight on this subject. And please come back for the next episode of Building Talk. Thanks a lot. I'm Bryan Falk. Bye. Awesome. Thanks a lot, man.